Well, it's wonderful to see everyone, and I'm very glad to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to talking about one of my favorite topics, which is the role of scientists in the philosophy of science. I'm obviously not going to be able to cover all of this huge topic, so I'm just going to have a brief agenda for this morning, which is a modest agenda to befit the fact that it's early in the morning. And so I'm going to mostly make three claims, 3 points, which the first of which is I don't think very many people are going to challenge me on this, the idea that scientists have made crucially important contributions to the philosophy of science as well as to science itself. Secondly, I'm going to cite a few historical cases to make the point that failing to recognize these contributions can result in failed history or flawed history and incorrect inferences from historical cases. And then finally, I'm going to make a point that I think is in the vein of this conference, that many of the past contributions were made possible by circumstances that are unlikely to be reproduced and for which there are challenges in the future. And I want to argue that we should be aware of that moving forward and try to support productive models for collaboration between the disciplines as much as possible, which I don't think will be a hard sell, but nonetheless, I'm going to make that point. Okay. So the first point that I want to make is that scientists have made crucially important contributions to the philosophy of science. And I don't think that necessarily there are very many people that are going to push very hard back against this, but in some ways this first section is going to be a tour of what I love about the interaction in the past between scientists and philosophers of science. But I also want to just mention at first, like a kind of rival model for the history of philosophy of science, according to which the role of the scientist in philosophy of science is to build scientific theories, right? So scientists create scientific theories and write them down and test them and so forth, and they do the work of science. And they come to understand a particular field, evolutionary biology, particle physics, et cetera. And a philosopher defends arguments about those theories, explanations, and understandings, and these are two completely separate pursuits, right? So this would be the kind of rival model. In this role, in this picture of the history of the philosophy of science, scientists would have a kind of indirect role in the philosophy of science itself. So philosophers would write arguments about scientific theories and results, in which they're interpreting what's going on in science, whereas scientists are the authors of the theories and results. And so then scientists might be indirectly relevant to HOPOS, but they're not really the subject of HOPOS, so you wouldn't really be writing a paper about a scientist talking about his role in the history of philosophy of science, but rather talking about here's a scientist, what they did in science, and then the philosophers talk about that, right? So we're the people who talk about science, the scientists are the ones who do it. So in this case, the subject of HOPOS in this picture would be philosophers and their arguments about science. So if we stop here, this would be a really short talk. This would be over. We could all go have coffee, right? But even if one is a very strictly and sort of robustly philosophical thinker, I think we can poke holes in this picture, right? I mean, even if we really want to talk about philosophy a lot. So for one thing, scientists and philosophers interact with each other. So Einstein was very generous, for instance, in reading philosophers' books about relativity. Einstein will come up again. And he often responded with, your book was excellent. It was so great. I really loved it. I read it with pleasure, except, and then he would make a devastating objection to the book that completely undermined. But so, for instance, Schlick wrote a book about space and time in physics, and Cassira wrote Einstein's theory of relativity. And Einstein at least said he read both of them and corresponded with the authors and made very incisive comments about them. Don Howard, just to go further, has argued in very strong terms that Albert Einstein should be given credit for his contributions not just to science but to philosophy of science. So to some extent, for this first conclusion of this paper, I can just piggyback on Don's work and say, look, Einstein should be credited as a philosopher. He had a strong interest in philosophy. He read philosophy. He wrote a lot of philosophy about relativity. Eric Banks also published a really interesting book in 2003 called Ernst Mach's World Elements, a study in natural philosophy. Right, so that subtitle is not coincidental or arbitrary. The first chapter of that book is about Banks placing Mach in the tradition of natural philosophy and arguing that that was in fact what he was doing. And of course, many of Mach's works, like Analysis of Sensations, are works that we read in HOPOS as part of the history of the philosophy of science. And so that's a lot of the important work that that book does. So when we leave out scientists and their work and their contributions in the history of the philosophy of science in particular, what do we miss? I think we miss a lot, as should be obvious from the topic and orientation of this paper, but I want to make two specific points that I'm going to somewhat support in the time that we have. The first is that we miss the continuity of the development of the philosophy of science, which is important historically, right? So scientists formulated and challenged arguments in the philosophy of science in particular. So you can just think of Duhem, for instance, who's responsible for, I don't think I have to tell anybody here. So if we only count arguments when philosophers make them, according to the kind of toy picture that I mentioned earlier, we might not lose much in content. So if all we're doing is a kind of Kuhnian science textbook where we're sort of summarizing what the arguments are, we might get the arguments right? Because we would just say, well, look, we're not going to talk about Duhem, we're going to talk about the philosophers who officially formulated what Duhem had to say. But we're going to miss a great deal historically because we're going to lose accuracy of the historical picture, which is then the second point I want to make. So for an accurate historical picture, we need to know what motivated a particular position, right? So who actually made the argument and why? This is a relatively simple point, but I nonetheless think that it needs to be made because it's important to sort of challenge this division between scientists as writing science and philosophers as writing philosophy. So if we don't properly register science as contributors, scientists in particular as contributors, then we're going to end up with a gappy story where we don't really talk about who had the motivation to make a particular argument and why. Okay, so who are some of the people who we might talk about? And I'm going to say right off that these are going to be some of the people who I'm the most familiar with and some of the examples I'm the most familiar with. And part of the idea of this talk, since it's early in the morning, is to get people thinking about their own favorite examples and what you've studied in your own work. So Laura Snyder has obviously pointed out in the Philosophical Breakfast Club, she centers on four central subjects, one of whom is William Whewell, who engaged in obviously a famous debate on the inductive method with John Stuart Mill. This is one example. The Philosophical Breakfast Club itself is an example of productive collaboration between scientists and philosophers that I'm going to be touching on later. But then there are these books. Oh, good. It kept, my slideshow kept leaving out Du Châtelet, which was actually kind of funny. Okay. I did put her in there. So there are these books from the history of philosophy of science, right? I mean, so one way of looking at the point that I'm making here is a lot of us in HOPOS work on these books, right? But they're written by Maxwell and Mach and Hertz and Du Châtelet, and these are all, at least to some extent, scientists. I could have put a whole bunch more here, and I'm going to mention a bunch more people in a minute. But one way to look at this is just to think, if you have these books and you're reading them, you're reading the history of the philosophy of science as well as the history of science. And to a lot of us, that would just be kind of obvious, right? So I want to just flag that to start out with. Another example, so this is obviously from the left, there's Helmholtz with some of his scientific apparatus. So Hermann von Helmholtz's handbooks for physiology of perception and optics contain substantial philosophical material beyond his popular and philosophical essays that are obviously labeled as such, right? So even if you're going to be talking about Helmholtz's work in science, there's quite a few methodological and philosophical reflections in the handbooks on science. He thought that it belonged there. Then, of course, I don't have to mention that Helmholtz also wrote a lot of philosophy, right, and was engaged directly with philosophy. William James is an interesting figure, right? I mean, of course, so one can read Alex Klein's excellent work on him, and one of the things about, and others, but one of the things about William James is that, of course, he was a famous psychologist, and founded a psychology lab at Harvard with Hugo Münsterberg. But he was also a pragmatist philosopher and is included in the history of pragmatist philosophy, and it would be very odd to have a history of pragmatist philosophy that didn't feature James. So he's a good figure for this purpose. Then Margaret Washburn, who wins by having a dog in her picture. So she, which is, it's stiff competition with the James photo. I really like that one. So Margaret Floyd Washburn, she was a psychologist. She also worked with Mary Calkins, who was also a psychologist. And she's going to come up again. But she wrote numerous articles that were published in Mind in the Journal of Philosophy. She was a contributing philosopher. So one of the questions that people might have in this discussion is, well, these were scientists who wrote methodological reflections on philosophy, but they weren't really publishing in philosophy. They didn't really contribute to the textual history of the history of philosophy of science. That's not even really the case, as we'll see in a minute. Okay. So another historical episode that included significant and substantial contributions from scientists is the catastrophism uniformitarian debate, which involved scientists, theologians, and philosophers, and it was basically a class reunion for natural philosophy. And some of the figures there were Cuvier, Sedgwick, Lyell, and again, our friend Whewell. Okay, so again, I did say this was going to be a kind of tour of scientists in philosophy of science. Then there are the many, 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 many reflections on physics that happen in the 19th and 20th century. I already mentioned Einstein, but Poincaré, Pierre Duhem, and Moritz Schlick, who is, again, like James, is a physicist, also, of course, a member of the Vienna Circle and a philosopher. And then there's the quantum theory. You have Max Planck and his debate with Ernst Mach, Paul Dirac, Eugene Wigner, Hermann Weyl, and Emmy Noether, right? These are all figures who've written things that figure in the history of science and also in the philosophy of science. And then I just can't, I can't help but just giving a huge long list of these things. But again, this is still a partial list, right? So you have statistical mechanics, Boltzmann, Maxwell's demon, Gestalt theory and psychology, which we're going to talk about again in a second. Accounts of explanation and law from Oppenheim and Hempel, who it's worth mentioning, were scientists as well as writers in philosophy. And then the mathematical work from Gödel, Hilbert, and Cantor, and I selected from a very large group of mathematicians who we could talk about contributing to philosophy. So now I want to look at, what do we miss specifically when we leave the contributions of scientists out? So what are some specific cases? So one specific case is actually Gestalt theory. So this is one case where I think, so Gary Hatfield has talked about this recently. So these are pictures, of course, of Kohler, Kafka, and Max Wertheimer, and then a Gestalt illusion. So Hatfield argues in an article called Kafka, Kohler, and the Crisis in Psychology that the Gestalt theorists considered Gestalt psychology to be the basis of recommendations to change the way philosophers regard certain phenomena. So they thought this themselves, and several of them were also kind of closet philosophers. Like Wertheimer was a Spinoza fan, and so they were working on philosophy themselves. They considered themselves to be doing work that challenged philosophical ideas, and they formulated these challenges explicitly. So it wasn't just that they kind of thought that their work had philosophical consequences. They actually thought through what those consequences would be and how people might think about them. So Hatfield says, I'm not going to go into detail here, but he says Gestalt psychology, Kafka claimed, could offer speculative philosophers a unified framework founded on natural scientific methods. And Gestalt psychology, in his account, could develop a philosophical side, and that this was a guiding motivation for Gestalt psychology itself, was that it was a kind of program in philosophy. So one way to think about this is there are a lot of philosophers of science. Thomas Kuhn, philosopher of science, also physicist, right? Oppenheim, Grelling, and Hempel were all influenced by Gestalt theory in one way or another. And one way to look at this is to say, well, they took Gestalt theory, they took their own understanding of it, and then they interpreted it through a philosophical lens. But I actually think, as Hatfield notes, the Gestalt theorists saw their own work as having philosophical consequences and formulated those consequences explicitly and talked about them. And so instead of assuming actors' categories and assuming, the Gestalt psychology was formulated in this way and then it was reacted to in this way by philosophers, The interesting historical task would be to look at the influence of Gestalt theory as a problem and to tease out who first formulated which position and why, right? Okay, it's now my favorite. I seriously considered just reading the first 3 lectures from Ludwig Boltzmann's Lectures on Natural Philosophy, because they're great, and I definitely recommend them. At one point, Boltzmann asked the crucially important question, is philosophy crime, illness, or insanity? Which I think is, we should all ask that question. Basically, what Boltzmann does in the first 3 lectures, first he throws a lot of shade on Mach, but then he also talks about, I've been asked to give these lectures on philosophy, and he's actually very kind of kindly, he's a little shy about it. He says, I'm not really sure why I've been asked. And he says, I scarcely belong in the discipline at all. And he says, so why have I been asked to give these, fancy lectures in natural philosophy? And he says, but doesn't that suggest my capacity even the more? Isn't it better for professors of medicine and technology to be able to practice what they preach? Perhaps I was chosen not because I've written on logic, but because I belong to a science where one has the opportunity to put logic into practice. Okay, so why was he's kind of musing on, like, why might a scientist be asked to give lectures on philosophy? And just a brief note, they had to, by the 3rd lecture, actually, they had to get a bigger room. So that might have been one of the reasons, but I won't go into detail about this quote, but I really had to give it because it's really hilarious. He says, I have actually tried to peek into the literature on philosophy to prepare for these talks, but this did not help. I turned to Hegel to master the deepest of the deep, but you know how that went. I turned to Schopenhauer for his lively style, but there are ladies present. I would really love to know what the context was for that. And then to Herbart, where I observed psychology distorted. As for Kant, he was not fully honest or straightforward. I turned against philosophy and began to hate it as if it were all a sham, right? So after this extremely relatable passage, you might think that Boltzmann just rejected philosophy altogether. But by the end, he's actually about to discuss a different approach to philosophy that he finds more appealing. And this is a version of skepticism that banishes meaningless questions, like the division between mind and matter, or whether objects are as we perceive them, or other subjects of metaphysics. And Boltzmann says, if these questions are really meaningless, then why do they irresistibly return? That is, what can one do about them to make them disappear forever? The task of my current lecture is to find the answer. Now, of course, on the one hand, you might say, well, this isn't a great task to make these philosophical questions disappear. On the other hand, you might think about other people who had that goal. And so I will just point out that Boltzmann's influence on the philosophy of science is a very tortured question, and I'm not going to settle it. But I think, we can all agree on certain things, like, for instance, that Boltzmann participated in debates on atomism with Mach and others that had a recognized influence on philosophical thinking, that Feyerabend and Popper were very impressed by Boltzmann. Feyerabend wrote an encyclopedia article about him, and Popper talks about him in his autobiography. And more indirectly, Boltzmann had an influence on Wittgenstein, who, of course, went on to influence logical positivism. And then that, many people have written on that sort of sequence of influence. Okay, so getting to the third point. So these are some past, I've mentioned Gestalt theory, I've mentioned Boltzmann, I've given a kind of tour of scientists' contributions to philosophy of science. I think, and I don't have an hour to kind of further drive home my point, but I will take an hour to further do that if you find me later. I think that there are many, many past contributions that scientists have made. I also think that they were made possible by circumstances that are unlikely to be reproduced in the future, right? So I think there is kind of a challenge, even though I think it's undeniable that scientists have made direct contributions to philosophy, I think there are some challenges to that continuing, and we should be aware of that moving forward and support productive models for collaboration. So one thing that made these contributions possible was cross-training. Right, so for instance, Boltzmann learned about philosophy by taking philosophy classes and the fact that there were philosophers around. And a lot of other scientists, if you were in Berlin, if you were in Vienna, you were just You were right there. So there was cross-training that emerged from the traditions of Wissenschaft and natural philosophy. Scientists had the opportunity to learn philosophy at school and university and vice versa. And when they found out what philosophical problems were, they took the opportunity to apply them in their own work. Something that I think I don't have to go into great detail about is that cross-training is nominally encouraged and in reality somewhat discouraged by modern university structure. So anyone who's taught an interdisciplinary seminar and only gotten credit for the students in their department registering under their number will know what I'm talking about, right? So what else made these contributions possible? Debates, right? So I really think that debates are a really productive area of discourse to look into historically, to look at the contributions of scientists to philosophy of science. And without going into huge detail, one of the reasons for this is that the stakes are lower and the stakes for entry are lower, right? If you're entering into a debate, you don't necessarily have to publish like a long paper in which you already have absorbed kind of the norms of the discipline and understand everything that's happening. You can enter into a debate and simply make a contribution from your own perspective and your own disciplinary training, right? And so this makes debates an easier place for people to enter into productive conversation. So, for instance, we could think of Max Planck and Boltzmann's debates with Ernst Mach, Einstein's debate with Bergson, catastrophism and uniformitarianism, and the Whewell-Mill debate, and I'm sure people can, again, think of tons of examples from their own work, right? So Boltzmann, I've only written a single treatise having philosophical content in my life, and that carried the title On the Question, this is actually completely false, right? He wrote lots of things about, and this carried the title On the Question of the Objective Existence of Objects in Inanimate Nature. The history of its origin is simple. I'd involved myself in a lively philosophical controversy which had broken out among physicists, right? I had intervened in favor of the atomic theory. We knew that, right? Okay. So one thing is that many debates now have moved on to social media. I'm going to say something in a minute about one reason why that might be true. And in some ways, that's democratizing, right? Like you can have a debate with, you can go on, Twitter and challenge Sabine Hassenfelder if you want. Do not do that. Well, unless you want to. But, the bad thing about the old way of debates is that the people who were invited to join in were these elite figures, right? Like you had to be an important person who people thought was sort of worth joining in the debate. Social media, on the other hand, does not always promote democracy in the way that it has changed the conversation, right? So I think that there are sort of critical points to be made about that development. Okay, editorial policy is something that I would be remiss if I didn't mention as something that can either be a very positive or a very negative thing in terms of encouraging collaboration and disciplinary cooperation between scientists and philosophers of science. So, for instance, as many of you know, the journal Mind published a lot of really exciting articles in its first run when it was edited by Broad. I always remember that because his name is perfect for, he was very broad-minded, he published a lot of things. So Helmholtz's articles on geometry, Mach's articles on geometry, Wundt's article on philosophy in Germany, and she comes up again, the psychologist Margaret Washburn published a paper on subjective colors and the phenomena of attention, as well as a discussion of the psychology of deductive logic in the journal Mind in its first run. When the editorship passed to Moore and then Ryle, the party was kind of over, as this is a well-known development. And a later editor, D.W. Hamlin, says that it was under Moore's editorship that the journal reached its Olympian heights, right? And so Broad is sort of swept aside. But the opposite is really true for a historian of the philosophy of science in some ways, because the first print run of Mind is just amazing for historical material. So I do want to just mention some of the challenges for publishing and research. There are many more, but since I'm looking at this from a kind of synoptic perspective, I just want to mention some of the challenges, and I think we can talk about this when we get to discussion in a minute. It's difficult to get a debate published. So you might say, well, okay, I can propose a special issue of a journal, but then everybody has to have their papers kind of ready at the same time, right? You can have a book that's a collection of papers, but again, it's the same thing. If you go to an editor, some editors maybe might be willing to do this, but if you go to an editor and say, we want to publish some papers, but like in various different issues over time, and like we're going to have one person intervene and then another person and then another person over years, like that's kind of a hard sell. to a lot of journals, unless the people involved, again, are extremely elite figures that they'd be happy to get any paper from. So another challenge that's very well known that I won't go into great detail about is specialization and professionalization. So as much as we might try to find a format that encourages contributions from science in modern day philosophy of science, professional considerations matter. Editorial standards tend to be specialized. Thirdly, very simply, scientists need to get grants and run labs and do stuff that takes up a lot of their time, and they're really busy. And so in order for them to make contributions about their own science, we have to encourage them to do that, right? So how can we do that? Well, we might talk about models for productive engagement. And one thing, I'm going to start at a kind of high-level view, and then I'm going to come down a bit, and then we're going to be done. So there is an end in sight. Okay. Solidarity, right? So one model is just thinking of philosophers and philosophers of science as talking about the same thing, right? We're all talking about science, we're all interpreting science, we're all looking, we're all thinking about the philosophical considerations of science. And here, we might look to the Vienna Circle and the Berlin Group, and to logical empiricism in general. It's giving a model for scientific philosophy, as Alan Richardson points out in a recent book. At its best, we might have groups, workshops, institutes, et cetera, that have a sense of common purpose, addressing similar questions and so on. So in some contexts, like large-scale scientific research projects, philosophers can become embedded researchers. So contemporary examples here might be Michela Massimi with CERN, the epistemology of the LHC project, and the Black Hole Initiative. Two plugs for the Black Hole Initiative. But we might also look at broader cases of institutes and projects and workshops that have been founded in this vein. So the Institute for Humanities and Cultural Studies in Iran, which is crying out for work on it and its founding and history, from biological practice to scientific metaphysics, which I think some of you are familiar with. The Indian Institute of Science Education and Research in Bhopal is another really interesting case. And the Fill-in Biomed program in Bordeaux and worldwide is another great program that I think fits under this rubric. There's also this interesting phenomenon of scientists becoming philosophy professors, or at least natural philosophy professors. So Sean Carroll is now the Homewood Professor of Natural Philosophy at Johns Hopkins. David Albert, of course, is trained as a physicist, as you can see, and is a professor of philosophy at Columbia. So these are examples, of course, not easily repeated examples, but these are examples of current productive collaboration. And in finishing this, I'm almost to the end. There is a really new, really interesting project at Case Western Reserve University, spearheaded by Chris Halfa, which is a science writing track that's under the English MA, but it's in collaboration with the philosophy department. The curriculum is focused on developing journalists and developing students' ability to examine the dynamics of scientific communities. Students participate in journal clubs, lab meetings, conferences, and meetings for large-scale collaborations. This is from Chris Halfa, by the way, the description of the program. And the hope is that, he says, that we can train journalists to ask questions and inform audiences about the social dimensions of scientific knowledge, to give them a more realistic image of how science works and what they can expect it to deliver. And so this is a new MA program in basically science journalism, science writing. And part of the idea is to kind of embed students in scientific practice and to engage with scientists. And so I think this is a really interesting model. So just to finish, I think that it's worth pointing out that these models for productive engagement in the past didn't just happen. Even they didn't just happen. Ludwig Boltzmann was asked to give lectures on natural philosophy, and again, he was even a little diffident about it. Einstein was asked constantly about the philosophical ramifications of his own theory. He was pestered constantly with people sending him books, and he actually read them. You couldn't get Duhem or James to stop writing philosophical theories, so they didn't have to be asked, but so there is a difference between there. But nonetheless, there was sort of deliberate productive engagement between the disciplines. And just to conclude, scientists formulating their own views and theories in philosophy of science has almost always been a good thing for the discipline. And the question is how to encourage that given the challenges that exist. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
So we are capturing audio and therefore need the microphone. So, Corey.
Hey, how are you? So I want to push back against the idea that the interaction or the contribution between philosophy and science is less or is threatened and maybe less common than it used to be. I think it really depends where you're looking at. Right. So, in my own field, like psychology and neuroscience, or philosophy of psychology and philosophy of neuroscience, there's extensive exchanges between the two. Evolutionary biology has been rooted in exchange with the leading evolutionary biologists for the last 50 years. Look at the journal, also depending on which journal you're looking at. Philosophy of science, BGPS, maybe don't publish much work by scientists, mind and language, biology and philosophy do. So it's really going to depend on which areas. And I think it should tell us something about the conditions under which interactions between scientists and philosophers fruitfully happen. There must be something about the science, something about its stage, something about its period. Anyway, right. You get the gist.
I do, yes. Yes, and I can easily retreat to, I think there are challenges. And I think that one of the challenges is how do we, so first, let me just say where I totally agree with you. So I think one of the really, really, really interesting sort of newer developments is the development of disciplines that result from the engagement, or that have at least been informed or motivated by the engagement between science and other disciplines, whether that be philosophy, history, psychology. Well, psychology. You get what I didn't mean to claim that psychology isn't a science. That's another talk. Just kidding. But the idea is, sorry. But the idea that I do want to push is that in order for there to be a kind of recognized discourse where scientists are contributing to the philosophy of science, there doesn't have to necessarily be like a centralized depot where there's a single journal that formalizes what's happening, but there nonetheless does have to be a kind of a recognition in the discipline of the work that's being done. And so I think that in some cases, what's kind of frustrating is like how easy it would be to, for instance, have sessions at the APA or talk about, the contributions of people from different disciplines in the philosophy of science, the contributions of scientists, and how to encourage that. And so I think really like the main tenor of what I'm saying is first the historical point that, if we miss this out, then we miss a lot of stuff in the history of philosophy of science, but then also that these things don't happen organically very easily. And so we need to kind of try to shore up institutions and yeah. Thanks.
So I want to follow on that and point out that a lot of these things are existing, but they're actually not in the philosophy journals, they're in the science journals.
Right.
And so, for example, I also come from neuroscience.
Yes.
And I can think of a dozen philosophy papers published in primary neuroscience journals which address things like what is computation and modeling in neuroscience. We just had a big paper we did with a whole bunch of both philosophers and scientists that Journal of Neuroscience, when we did the preprint, Journal of Neuroscience wrote to us and said, will you put this in JNeurosci? And now it's the intro for most neuroscience programs.
Oh, wow.
Right? These things do exist, like causation. There was a big debate. There was a debate at the Society for Neuroscience meeting this year on what is causality and what do you talk about causation when you're talking about biology. So these things are existing. They're just not existing they may not be, I don't know, but they may not be in the philosophy journals, but they're absolutely in the science journals.
Fabulous. Thank you. See, this is exactly right. This is exactly the kind of thing that I mean is that like there's, so remember this is in the history section, right? So part of what I'm saying is that if we're going to do a complete history of the development of philosophy of science, and we just look in the philosophy journals, we just look at what was presented at the PSA, right? Excellent though that may be, we're going to miss out a lot of stuff, right? So. So I think that I'm not disagreeing. What I'm kind of saying is, one of the things that I'm saying is just the simple point that if we're doing a history, we need to look at all the philosophy that gets published, which is not necessarily the philosophy that gets published in philosophical venues. So I think I'll stop there because I think that's reasonably defensible, so I'll stop there. Okay. All right. Hey. Hi.
Hey, thanks. Brian Roberts from LSE Philosophy.
Wonderful.
I love the trajectory of this talk, and I am curious about how these patterns change over time. We seem to go through phases, so I'm more familiar with the physics examples that you gave. We seem to go through phases where the scientific community is really philosophical, and other phases where they're really against it. And I sort of feel like anecdotally, perhaps also in Europe right now, there's a lot of support for philosophy amongst physicists. Like, there's a lot of conferences, and in my short career now, it's changed, let's say in the last 10 to 20 years, quite a lot in that front. From, I guess, a time when string theorists were ruling the world and just saying, like, we don't need philosophers at all, to now some, I would say, the sort of power people, the scientific elites, are no longer the Stephen Hawking, the Brian Greene. They're more people who are philosophically interested, like Carlo Rovelli. Right. And so, I'm just interested in what drives those changes. Like, is it something we're doing, or is it something they're doing? Is it just the randomness that sometimes the scientific elites are philosophical? Or does the content of does the content of science become more or less philosophical depending on the topic or the period? So interested in your thoughts.
Yes. I say yes, not because I'm like agreeing with all that, but I mean, I agree with what you said. And I also think this is exactly, like, in some ways what I've just said is very simple, right? Like, there's a lot of people who are going to agree that, like, of course scientists have formulated their own philosophical positions and had an influence on philosophy of science. But exactly the questions that you're asking, how do we actually track the development about attitudes towards science in the scientific community, especially given the complexity that there is no such thing as the scientific community, right? As you've pointed out, like, there's all these different communities that are interacting with each other. So making the simple point that we should acknowledge the contributions of scientists then raises this huge set of questions, I think. And the ones that you've raised to me are very central, right? Like, how do we map this development? That's the history question. And it's history of philosophy, but it's also kind of the sociology of, like, scientific communities and philosophical communities, and how do these institutions and how do arenas and venues, that's the word I was looking for, how do venues for exchange and venues for people discussing come up? And as we just heard, it can be as easy as an editor saying, I'd like this to be in the journal. But why did the editor say that? Why did he or she think that that was the right decision to make? So my answer to your question is that there is no possible way that I can answer those questions in this in a question period. But I think that I'm very excited because the giving the talk, the point of giving the talk is for these questions to get raised, really. Yeah.
Thanks. Really, sorry, right here.
Angela, hi.
I have the mic now.
Yes, great.
Thanks, really interesting talk. I wanted to ask about a possible additional part of a diagnosis for how things are now compared to how they used to be. So you touched on disciplinarity, right, and increasing disciplinarity as being maybe part of the cause. When I think about what I see from my perspective, the disciplines that I know best and sort of where the people who I'm connected to, it strikes me that where we see that overlap between science and philosophy now, at least again in cases I'm familiar with, is very much kind of one-directional philosophy into the science. And in fact, I think many of the contemporary examples that you gave reveal that, have that sort of emphasis, and like fill in biomed, right? That's explicitly the goal, right? Is getting philosophy into the science. And I wonder then what your thoughts are on, this is the sort of possible kind of additional diagnosis. I wonder whether this doesn't actually carry a lot of the weight for the difference, for the change, is what I want to call like the erasure of philosophy, right? So you talked about these historic scientists who learned philosophy. Yeah. When I think about even the scientists, including really impressive scientists who I've collaborated with, they don't know what the like general problems are in our field. They're not kind of motivated to read up on that. Certainly, for the most part, don't know the kind of contemporary lay of the land in what's a concern in philosophy of science. And we also, as philosophers, don't tend to think that they should, right? We think that we're taking largely our lead from what they're worried about. I wonder what you think about that kind of devaluing and kind of minimizing or even erasure of philosophy from the kind of broad discourse as part of the difference.
Yeah, I agree. So I think so. I do want to be careful. Like, I don't want to actually argue that the current situation is necessarily worse in some way. I think it's different, and I think what I wanted to emphasize, and I think this is picking up on what you're saying, is that there is this new set of challenges, right? There are a set of challenges, and I think this is another one. Like, if you look at the time period that I'm most familiar with, the 19th and 20th century, the relationship between philosophy and science was very different. The relationship between philosophy and psychology was very different, right? Like, there were a lot of philosophers, as Martin Cush has pointed out, who were in psychology departments, and vice versa. And the disciplinary split only happened later, as we all know. But I think that becomes one of the problems, is that there's kind of this sense that philosophy needs to establish itself as a distinct discipline, and then there's less of a sense of the kind of continuity, and here I would talk about like content continuity and disciplinary continuity, right? Because someone mentioned Carlo Rovelli, right? And some of the philosophy of physics, like there's like, if you're a scientist working on the foundations of space-time and you're a philosopher, like, you have a lot to talk about, even if you haven't had necessarily like strict philosophical training, right? You know about space-time, and like that's a lot of it, right? So I think that sometimes that's one of the things that I want to emphasize, that is exactly, I think this is picking up on your point, that the barriers are actually lower than we think. Like, we don't need to insist on, like, first you must read. So, like, not to go off on a tangent, but the physicist Gerard de Hooft had a website one time that was called something like "So You Want to Be a Physicist," and it had like this incredibly imposing, first you must learn this, and then you must learn that. And I think that, like, if we do that in philosophy, and we say first you must effectively become a professional philosopher before you can contribute to philosophy of science, like, that's wrong. I will just say that. And so I think that's part of what comes up from your question. Yeah. Does that answer? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, let's thank Lydia.
Thanks very much.